Hi there. My name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm being joined by Dan Pompei. Dan is a senior NFL writer at The Athletic, who's been covering the sport for more than 3 decades, and is one of 48 members on the Pro Football Hall of Fame's Selectors Board. In this episode, I chat with Dan about his first ever interview with an NFL player, his process reporting on the Super Bowl amidst hundreds of journalists, and his transition from print to digital media. Whether this is your first episode or you've been following along on my Chronicles journey, make sure to like, watch, and subscribe to my YouTube channel on the bottom right hand of your screen. This is episode 12 of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, for this episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by Dan Pompei. He's a senior NFL writer at The Athletic. Dan, thank you so much for joining the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
Good to be with you today. I'm going to enjoy the opportunity to talk to you.
And Dan, I want to start back to your earlier career and your interview with Doug Plank, the safety at the Chicago Bears. Were you nervous for that interview? What was that interview like, and how did that shape your writing and professional journalism career?
Well, it's an interesting question. That was my first interview with an NFL player, and I was in college at the time. And things were a little different back then, because there wasn't the demand for players that you have now from the media. There were a lot fewer media members. And, I think all the teams were kind of more of mom and pop shops as opposed to, big corporations in and of themselves. So I was able to go up to Hallis Hall and sit down with Doug Plank and interview him. And, he was about as nice and disarming as could be. So it was a pleasant experience, and it was interesting, and it kind of continued my interest in the game and writing about the game.
And you've covered the game, Dan, for over 3+ decades. You've covered over 30 Super Bowls. And you're very interesting because you have the chance to be a pool reporter at the Super Bowl. And for those of you who don't know, 2 reporters get selected and they get to cover the closed practices of one of the teams and then write a report that then goes back to the journalists who are covering the game. What is your process when you are covering those closed-door practices that not many people get the chance to see? And what are you trying to accomplish with those pool reports that are being sent back to the journalists covering the game?
Well, it's mostly about news. You don't want something to happen that needs to be reported by everybody that, that you missed. So it's a little nerve-wracking from that standpoint because you want to be on top of things. For instance, if a player doesn't show up to practice, you need to know that he's not there. Or if a player gets hurt, you can't miss that. If a player kind of limps off or whatever, you need to find out what's going on. So those are the main things. You sit there, you watch practice, you observe everything, you talk to people. Afterwards, you have an opportunity to interview the head coach every day and ask him, whatever questions you might want to ask him about what happened in the practice. And then you write a small report about what happened. They're pretty, the league and the teams get to approve of the report. So it's not like regular journalism where, you write what you think is best and they can't censor you. So they do have an opportunity to look at that and change things if they want.
And I'm sure being at a Super Bowl is such a unique experience. Like I said off the top, you've been to over 30 of them. And Dan, there are so many reporters there trying to report and cover this game and the stories from these 2 teams that are being played in this game. How do you cover such a big event, and do you feel like it's overwhelming at times to be able to write stories that so many other journalists and reporters are trying to cover at the same time?
I think, first of all, you can't try to cover everything. You have to kind of look for little cracks and crevices and things that you find interesting or different, and understand that, as you said, there are hundreds of other reporters trying to find the same little kernel or little, maybe it's a needle in the haystack. But you have to find a way to, I think, bring something to the story that is maybe unique or rare or creative or different, because you want to give value to it, as opposed to just being another story that can be read anywhere or written by anyone.
Can you recall a story that of your Super Bowls that you've covered in your career that stands out to you because it goes beyond just the normal Super Bowl week story and that really appeals to you?
Well,
I know I'm putting you on the spot here.
Yeah, I'll tell you about, one time when I was a pool reporter, it was when the Bucs played the Raiders. And it was interesting because John Gruden was the coach of the Bucs at the time, and he had come over from the Raiders, was traded by the Raiders to the Bucs. And when he was with the Raiders, he had acquired Rich Gannon as their quarterback, and Gannon had a great year, the year that the Raiders went to the Super Bowl and played the Bucs. So in practice, before the Super Bowl, the week of the game, Gruden actually played Gannon on the scout team, and he was playing quarterback himself and imitating Gannon. And it was, in addition to being very effective as a scout team quarterback, he also was hilarious because he was imitating him, and it was something that kept the Bucs loose and lively, and also helped them prepare. And of course, they went out and contained Gannon pretty well in the game.
It's funny you mentioned that game. It's actually the first Super Bowl that I remember watching as a little kid. So that's really fascinating that you mentioned that. And Dan, you transitioned over to the Athletic, and you spent many years on the print side. And I'm just curious if the transition for you from print to digital was challenging at all for you, or was it seamless?
Well, I think, anyone who has been in the business has been making that transition. They've been forced to make that transition gradually over many years. Just because now I'm working for an all-digital company doesn't really change much. I mean, prior to this, I was working for Bleacher Report, which is another all-digital company. And even when I was working before that, the Chicago Tribune, we did a lot that was online only. It really started back in the days. I joined the Sporting News when it was a magazine, but even then we started to do things that were exclusive for online or special for online. So it's been a gradual transition through the years. It's just one of the many ways that the business has changed since I got in it in the early 1980s.
Last question for you, Dan. And you mentioned about how the business has changed. And a lot of young journalists right now are going through, challenging times just because there's no sports going on, not many jobs, and just the evolving, changing nature of the industry. I'm curious if you have any advice for young journalists who are trying to break into the industry, and during this time where you're going to need to develop new skills and hone your craft so that when sports do come back, you can hit the ground running.
Yeah, it's a difficult time, obviously, for everybody, not just journalists. I would say the most important thing is not to get discouraged and to keep fighting, keep plugging, keep working. I think it's important that you get published as a journalist as much as you can. Get as many opportunities to write, hone your craft, try to find your voice. And the other thing is, don't be afraid to do anything. I mean, don't let anything be beneath you. I think, it's important to be able to have some humility and understanding that sometimes you have to start at the bottom. You don't have all the answers and you don't know everything when you're 23 years old. I think, the more you can do, the more value you could provide a company. So especially in today's age, nobody is really a specialist at any one thing anymore. You have to be able to do a lot of things. You have to be the baseball player who can run, catch, hit, field, do what are the 5 tools. You have to have all the tools that in your arsenal that are possible.
Dan Pompei, he's a senior NFL writer at The Athletic. Make sure to check out his content there. Dan, thank you so much for joining me on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles today.
Okay, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.